Coming soon.
Who was she?
What is she doing here?
A major new podcast series.
I noticed her.
Was she a spy?
Death in Ice Valley.
All these identities?
A 47-year-old mystery.
It was like a cover-up.
Search for Death in Ice Valley wherever you find your podcasts.
You can hear the preview now.
Subscribe now and you won't miss the first episode.
From the BBC World Service, welcome to the latest edition of the Documentary Podcast. Every week we bring you a range of stories from our presenters and reporters across the world. Please do rate the documentary on your podcast app and leave a comment. Let us know what you think.
I've just found a rising star of satire in the Arab world on YouTube. He's a young Egyptian cartoonist, Andil, in a homemade video doing a hilarious impersonation of a foul-mouthed, overbearing, middle-aged, know-it-all ignoramus. With prayer beads in one hand and a mobile phone and glittering fake Rolex watch on the other. The symbolism is obvious, at least for Andil's generation. He's taking aim at the patriarchal order that thwarted the revolts of the Arab Spring 7 years ago and made the young, like satirist Andil, angry and frustrated, with no other means to fight back than to ridicule the powerful. I'm Magdi and in this programme from the BBC World Service, Poking the Establishment, I'm going to take you on a trip to explore that ancient and lethal weapon of the powerless against the powerful. Political satire in the Arab world. Andil's show is called Akh Kibir, Big Brother in Arabic. The set is a hodgepodge of plastic flowers, red old-fashioned telephone, and at the top of the cardboard backdrop, the word Allah in gold lettering. We talked over the internet.
With Big Brother specifically, I was trying to open a conversation with people from the other end, where I wanted people to see themselves in a kind of ugly mirror in a way. And I was hoping that I could reach to some of these people, to people from older generations or people who believe that the way the country is being run right now is the right way. So I'm hoping that I can get out of this bubble of talking to people who already agree with me or people who already think the same way I think and manage to open some conversations with people from the other side.
So this is the ugly picture that Andil holds up to Egyptian society. His big brother has solutions for all of Egypt's problems.
بحكم موقعي ومنصبي الهام والاستثنائي في الحياة كأخ كبير وكلامي غير ملزم أتاح لي القدر.
Education? Schools are a Western import. Turn them into factories or police stations. Do you know how much cleaning school toilets cost per year? Millions. Children should be part of the productive labour force. Problem solved. Poverty? Eradicate the poor. Simple. Andil's big brother shoots from the hip.
I wanted to perform that anger or channel it through the character that I think is responsible for where we are, which is the character that I'm playing in the show. The middle-aged, conservative, fearful, doubtful person who believes that everything in the world should work the way he believes. So this is why the anger for me was a good vessel to communicate with people.
With a total clampdown on freedom of expression and ban on public demonstrations, Andil's generation were left with no other option or outlet for their anger. Satire for him has become almost a form of therapy.
Playing this character allowed me to explore certain feelings and allow myself to exhale a certain amount of anger that I must have accumulated. And I got to a point where I felt like if I kept that anger inside me any longer, I might go crazy. So it's better to have that craziness on the screen. So yeah, sometimes I don't know where's the line between my character and the character that I'm playing.
It's hard to understand Andil's despair and confusion without talking about the promise of the Arab Spring and the euphoria Andil's generation felt during that time.
It's not a riot, it's a revolution. We are defending ourselves, we are defending our freedom, our revolution.
In 2011, the people in several Arab countries rose up against their authoritarian rulers. Instead of democracy and rule of law, the outcome was something completely different. With the exception of Tunisia, all countries involved descended into civil war, including Syria, Yemen and Libya. In Andil's homeland, Egypt, the uprising toppled President Mubarak, but from then onwards, it went downhill. Today, Egypt is ruled by an austere army general who brooks no criticism or dissent. The fall from euphoria was particularly painful for Andil's generation, and Egypt is hopelessly polarized.
I remember the first time I got really worried was when they started arresting random people from the cafes or like going to houses of people and arresting people. And I remember receiving a phone call from a friend who said, "Don't go home tonight because there's a police truck in the street and they're arresting people." And I was like, whoa, that's the first time I have to change something about my life because of the possibility of going to jail. I work on having a relationship where this fear is constructive. And I would be lying if I said, no, I am not scared. It's true that I get scared every once in a while.
The fear and insecurity in Cairo is still relatively mild when compared to the vicious civil war that has engulfed Syria since 2011. Nearly 500,000 dead and millions more driven into exile. Those who wanted to criticize the Assad regime had no other option but to leave.
برنامج سيناريو مع همام حول.
Among them was a group of Syrian artists who have launched a satirical show called Scenario on a satellite channel. The program is put together in Turkey.
الشعب السوري شعب معروف بطيبة قلبه.
It's hosted by a famous theatre actor, Hammam Hout, who had defected to Syria's opposition. It's a mixture of political cabaret and diatribes against the regime. There are spoofs ridiculing President Assad himself, portrayed as a hapless village fool. It depicts the regime's religious leaders as men who tailor the sermons to suit their paymasters. Fadi Ashati is the director of the show. He says there was no way they could have made that program from Syria.
There's a huge risk. We regularly get death threats directed at staff, even those doing very minor jobs.
Some of your colleagues working out of Turkey will inevitably have members of their family still in Syria. Are they concerned about that?
A regime like this doesn't draw a line between a wife and a husband or a father and son. An entire family could be harmed as a result of our work. This is the hardest thing. How can you work under such pressure? The aim is to topple the regime. We don't just deal with Syria. The love of power is a rampant disease across the Arab world. Not challenging or standing up to the military or military rule exists in more than one country.
Poking the establishment in the Middle East can be a dangerous game. In fact, you could pay the ultimate price for upsetting the powerful. Here, in the heart of London, some 30 years ago, a famous Arab cartoonist, the Palestinian Naji al-Ali, was gunned down on this secluded back street. And the police are still looking for the killers.
On the 22nd of July 1987, Mr. Naji al-Ali was on his way to work. He was approached by a male from behind who shot him in the back of the neck. Shortly after the shooting, a second male was seen actually concealing a handgun, what's believed to be a handgun, in his coat. He then got into a left-hand drive grey or silver Mercedes and then also fled the scene.
London has always been a magnet for Arab journalists and dissidents. A recent example of this is a satirical news magazine website called Al-Hudud, which operates out of an office in London's high-tech hub in Old Street.
So what do we have today?
Aysam Uraiqat is Al-Hudud's co-founder and editor. He's holding the morning conference call with colleagues in Jordan.
They found some refugees in Libya, 300 refugees.
Your colleague there in Jordan mentioned the refugees who died as they were trying to cross the Mediterranean from the Libyan coast to southern Europe. That is not a funny news item. How can you turn that into something for people to laugh at? It's pretty tragic, actually.
It's incredibly tragic, and that's one of the most difficult challenges that we have, like between the civil wars and the various tragedies that are happening all around. It seems that a lot of what we have to do is cover the news and be able to not make fun of. That's not what we do. It's highlight it from another perspective, from a satirical perspective. If you go dark enough, there is satire to be found, and then you find yourself talking about things that people care about or should care about, but the media doesn't care about enough.
One example of the black comedy that caught my eye on the Hudud website is about Syrian police making arrests in cemeteries. And we've created a sketch in English for this BBC programme based on the spoof story.
El Hudud breaking news.
Syrian security forces have launched raids on a number of cemeteries and arrested several dead people. They'd perished during recent fighting in the area before the authorities managed to detain them.
Sources tell us the government's unhappy about cemeteries being used as safe havens. Charges against those arrested range from weakening patriotic sentiments to undermining the authority of the state.
And our sources refused to comment on whether the usual interrogation methods were used, but added that all available means would be deployed to extract confessions.
I mean, do you find that funny?
I don't think funny is the word with a lot of what we do. It's a combination of shocking and... what's the right word there? Can any of you think of the right word there?
طبعا الموضوع اللي نحن عم نحكي عنه هو غير مضحك أبدا.
Yes, look, I in Jordan just explained in Arabic that the Syrian story, of course, it is not funny, it's tragic, actually borders on the fantastical. And that is precisely the area Hudud operates in.
So I think when you see the paradox in what's happening with the way we worded it, I think you might actually end up laughing, but you'll hate yourself a little bit. That will make you think. That will make you see things from another perspective. There are great journalists who are doing amazing work in and around the Middle East, but they're not able to make people rethink how they're seeing things. And I think that's one of the powerful things about satire. So basically we're jolting people's perspectives.
For you, satire is a way of focusing minds, getting people to see a reality which is so painful, they've gotten used to it, they don't see it anymore, or they don't want to see it anymore.
Precisely. I couldn't have said it better.
There are red lines. Al Hudud carries stories sending up the Saudi royal family. But when I asked Assam about doing the same with the Jordanian royals, this happened.
That's a difficult one.
You don't want to answer it, that's fine.
We find ways around the lines that we have. So we can't have everything. Freedom of speech is a slogan. It's not a real thing that is applied. So you need to pick your battles on what you want to satirize. And if there's a point that I can make without getting certain people unhappy, I'd rather make it without that, if it means that I can operate for longer and I can continue doing the work that we're doing in the magazine.
In blunt terms, there could be consequences for what you're doing, for you or your family in Jordan.
I mean, always. You can't know. That's how the regimes work. They leave you not knowing so that you remain on your toes.
Political satire in the Arab world is, of course, much older than the uprisings of 2011, the civil wars that followed, the internet, or even television. Take the Cairo where I grew up, the bustling capital of culture in the Arab world. Jokes and satire were the antidote to the state propaganda of the 1960s, like this patriotic song that praises Egypt's march towards its own brand of Arab socialism. One of my favorite jokes from that time poked fun at the socialist economy and its chronic food shortages.
I'd like to buy a chicken, please.
What kind of chicken?
A chicken.
Yes, but what kind? We have frozen chicken, fresh chicken. What do you want?
Oh, I'll have fresh, please.
That's on the next floor up.
Hello. Can I have a fresh chicken, please?
Well, what kind of fresh chicken do you want? We have local or imported.
Oh, which is cheapest?
Well, of course, the Egyptian one is.
Oh, I'll have that.
Yeah, that'll be the next floor up.
Oh. Can I have an Egyptian fresh chicken, please?
Big or small? Broiler or tender young chicken?
Oh, for goodness sake, I want a big one.
Well, that'll be the next floor.
Oh! Can I have a fresh Egyptian broiler chicken, please?
That'll be 2 Egyptian pounds, please.
Right, here you are.
Oh, no, the cashier is on the ground floor.
Thank you. Where can I pick the chicken up?
Oh, that gentleman over there.
All right. Here, can I have my chicken, please?
Well, we don't actually have the chickens yet in store. We're waiting for deliveries to start. But what do you think about our new system?
أيها المواطنون مجلس الأنس الكريم.
To my mind, the greatest Arabic satirist of this era, and arguably the 20th century, is a poet by the name of Ahmed Fuad Negm, a master of Egyptian vernacular poetry who spoke to the common man. Together with an old and blind oud player, Sheikh Imam, the pair became an artistic phenomenon that reached all corners of the Arab world despite a ban on public performances. Negm's songs were recorded on cassettes, and I still have some of these tapes. And many years later, in a village outside Oxford, I met someone else who'd also cherished and kept tapes with Sheikh Imam performing Negm's satirical poems. His name is Professor Clive Holes, one of a handful of academics who studies Arabic vernacular poetry.
His target really was the leaders of independent Egypt from Abdel Nasser onwards. So he was a merciless critic of Anwar Sadat, and the one that followed him, Hosni Mubarak, most recently deposed as president in 2011. He saw him as being in the pocket of foreign powers. So he wrote extremely cutting, coruscating critiques of both these presidents. He had a fantastic wit and a brilliant, innovative use of Egyptian colloquial. You can't really make jokes in classical Arabic. You can't do it. What you have to do is to level with the audience and use the language that they use, but use it in an incredibly artful and comic fashion.
And how effective is that as, shall we say, a way of political opposition, of criticising authority?
It has been so effective that most of the people who've done it most effectively have found themselves in prison for quite long periods or under threat. Negm himself, I mean, he spent a total of around about 8 years in prison. At the end of his life, he got so old that there was no point really in putting him in prison anymore.
One fact stands out today, that without the wisdom
In 1974, the then President of the United States, Richard Nixon, made an historic visit to Egypt.
President Sadat of Egypt, we would not have made the progress toward peace that we have made. And the world owes him a great debt for what he has done.
It was a pivotal moment in Egypt's modern history. The country was realigning itself with the West and moving away from Soviet influence. Negm satirized the promise of the wealth and prosperity that would flow from closer ties with the West.
It's always dripping with irony. I mean, everything that Negm writes is, you've got to more or less assume that he doesn't really mean what he says. Do you want to do a quick translation of the...
شرفت يا نيكسون بابا يا بتاع الووترجيت.
Yeah, you've honoured us, Nixon.
نيكسون بابا يا بتاع الووترجيت.
Nixon Baba, oh, Daddy Nixon. Good old grandpa, you know, Bata il Watergate. Well, the one that is associated with Watergate, that is, of course, the Watergate scandal of the mid-1970s.
And then عملوا لك إيمة وسيمة.
Yeah, they've really bigged you up. Is the إيمة وسيمة? Yeah.
And the crunch line, which I found fascinating, سلاطين الفول والزيت.
Yeah, the sultans of fool, which is beans, and zayt, which is oil.
This line is an excellent illustration of Negm's verbal virtuosity. Beans with a dash of oil is the poor man's food in Egypt, often served in a bowl. Sultaniya, a word that sounds like sultan. In other words, Grandpa Nixon, you'll be feted by the oil-rich sultans of Arabia, who are in reality as cheap as a bowl of beans. With the rise of political Islam after the Arab Spring, ruthless groups such as the so-called Islamic State sprang up. It was only a matter of time before satirists took them on. This is the Lebanese band Ar-Rahil al-Kabir and the spoof song about the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It went viral on the internet from the day it was first performed in Beirut. The lyrics mock those who speak of Islam as a religion of mercy, yet kill innocent people in its name. The parody is also in the music itself, which mimics a popular religious incantation. Khalid Subeh is the group's founder and songwriter. For him, satire is the only way to cope with events in Syria. He told me that when you see atrocities that you cannot put or describe in words, it means reality has surpassed the imagination. You may want to use traditional ways to describe them, but actually reality has gone beyond that. These are atrocities that you never expected to see in your entire life, he said. That is why the best way to remain sane is to comment in a satirical way. Sandy Shamaoun is Ar-Rahil al-Kabir's lead female singer.
When a song can ridicule people like Islamic State, that becomes a form of resistance to them and their terror. You take sustenance from laughter, which isn't something new at all. Instead of feeling fear, you scoff at them. That gives you a lot of strength. Some people may think it's a form of entertainment, but in my opinion, it gives people a lot of psychological and moral strength.
But a program about Arabic satire is not complete without talking to those who've taken it to a global level. The internet is largely responsible for this. Many of the artists we've heard from are sophisticated online performers in Arabic. But one man, Karl Sharro from Lebanon, now writes and performs in English.
I'm going to read you my Twitter timeline.
Karl then pulls out a roll of paper.
I'm not the first person from the Middle East to hold up a scroll. Thousands of years from now, someone's gonna find this and base a religion on it.
Karl explained to me why he chose to move from political commentary to satire after the start of the Arab Spring.
I think about a year in, the situation became quite complicated and there was an absurdity to it, I think, that propelled me in the direction of satire because it almost became the only thing that can actually make sense of this absurdity of the Arab Spring, was laughing at it, mocking it, trying to kind of derive some absurd sense of order out of what was happening, be it the frustrated revolutions, the counter-revolutions as we call them. All these were kind of some of the bizarre things about it that I thought at the time, well, you know what, I've written about them in a serious manner for so long, but I think it's not doing it anymore for me personally, and that's how I shifted into satire.
And he complains that journalism oversimplifies seismic events.
After the emergence of ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State, as the so-called BBC prefers to call it, there was this tendency to write headlines that try to explain ISIS with one word, as in climate change caused ISIS, or Islam caused ISIS, or poverty caused ISIS. And the reality was much more complex than that. There were multiple factors at play.
So, if Karl thinks Western journalists oversimplify the Arab world, what's his take?
You want a simple one-line explanation for what caused ISIS? Here goes. The failure of the post-colonial elites to create genuine democratic societies and foster the historic mistakes of Arab progressive parties and their appeasement towards autocratic rulers, contributing to external meddling, hegemony, and outright military interventions, leaving a radical interpretation of religion as the only remaining ideology embodied by the caliphate, becomes attractive, particularly when coupled with a millenarian apocalyptic narrative. Simple.
There's one thing that has struck me making this programme about satire in the Arab world. It's that so many contributors spoke of how satire kept them sane, made more sense of a reality that to them had gone mad. This is best summed up by the young Egyptian satirist we heard at the beginning, Andil.
It's true that in very fluid worlds like where we live right now, it's kind of hard to have that satire have a role where the ideas or the ideologies themselves are kind of being dismantled and nobody knows anymore what's democratic and what's not, and what's fascist and what's not, and everything's so mixed. It's true that that makes it harder for satire to have a role and makes it harder for satire to avoid being completely vacuous and nihilistic. But I think people's belief in their right to make fun of the things that bother them is one of the most important things that people should fight for.
But let's not get too gloomy. This is satire after all. This is our version of a vintage Lebanese sketch about factional politics that still resonates.
So, they've agreed this time, have they? At long last. I mean, what about exactly?
They've agreed to set up a new party, the Disagreements Party.
The Disagreements Party?
Yep.
To do what exactly?
To organise the disagreements.
So, any disagreement? I mean, any disagreement can join, right?
Yep, that's absolutely correct. Look, let me explain. It's going to be a proper party. Swanky HQ, permanent staff.
Oh, permanent?
Oh, yes, like any other respectable party. It can hold press conferences, issue statements denouncing this, that and the other, like any other party.
And what about argumentative troublemakers and loudmouth grandstanders? Can they join too?
They can put in an application, and if they meet certain criteria, they're in.
And what about people who actually want to change things?
No. Anyone but those kind of people. They have a totally different ideology. We don't want them.
I'm Magdi Abdelhadi, and you've been listening to Poking the Establishment, which is a CTVC production for the BBC World Service.
Thank you for listening. There will be more from the documentary podcast soon. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. And don't forget, do try our other BBC World Service podcasts too.